I mean, just imagine stepping into a brand new job, right?
Yeah.
Like at the absolute pinnacle of your profession, you are handed the keys to this massive multi-billion-dollar institution.
Right. United States.
Exactly. And then in exactly 44 days, you don't just get fired, you basically trigger this massive existential crisis for millions of people.
Yeah.
You turn your entire global organization into a total laughingstock, and you secure exactly 0 wins along the way. So welcome to the deep dive.
It's the kind of timeline that almost defies the laws of professional physics. 44 days. It's wild.
It is wild, and I am so glad you're here with us today listening in because we are unpacking a story that has absolutely bewildered the sporting world. I mean, we are looking at the chaotic, just historically brief and frankly agonizing 44-day tenure of Igor Tudor
Yeah.
as the interim head coach of Tottenham Hotspur Football Club, a tenure that literally just came to a crashing halt in late March 2026.
And to really understand the sheer scale of this collapse, we have to look at it from multiple angles, which is exactly what our source material allows us to do today. It's so varied.
Exactly. We've pulled together a really fascinating stack of sources for you. So on one side, we have the traditional, forensic journalism. We've got a hard-hitting, incredibly sharp analysis by BBC Sports chief football writer Phil McNulty. And he basically takes a scalpel to the executive decisions, the boardroom politics, and all the structural rot behind this mess.
Right. So McNulty kind of anchors us in the cold, hard reality of the institution itself. But, to truly understand a football club in crisis, you can't just look at the executives sitting up in the luxury boxes.
No, absolutely no.
You have to look at the terraces or, well, in 2026, the digital terraces, right?
Which is exactly why we are also diving deep into the raw, just unfiltered digital pulse of the fans. We've pulled extensive real-time threads from several massive football subreddits for this.
The real frontline stuff.
Exactly. So we're looking at Wergoys, which is basically the digital sanctuary for Tottenham fans. We have Whirlpool FC, Worgedals for the Manchester United perspective, and then just the general our Premier League community. We are looking at how millions of people process trauma, anger, and honestly, comedy in real time.
And the contrast there is jarring, but it's so necessary.
Yeah.
Because you have this highly polished BBC analysis sitting directly adjacent to the visceral, deeply tribal, emotionally unhinged reactions of fans who literally organize their entire lives around this one team's schedule.
Right. And that brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. I want to be very clear with you from the jump here. If you are not a soccer fan, if you don't care about, a high pressing system or the offside trap, stay with us anyway.
Oh, absolutely.
Because this isn't just some tactical breakdown. This is a sociological look at how modern communities process spectacular, very public failure.
Yeah, we are going to explore the severe tension between bitter, tribal, sports rivalry and just basic human empathy. And we're going to examine how found expectations essentially dictate their reality.
And crucially, we are going to try and figure out if Igor Tudor was the architect of his own disaster, like pouring gasoline on a fire, or if he was simply a victim, just a guy thrown into a burning building by a boardroom's grand failed experiment.
Right.
So let's jump right in, because before we can understand the psychological meltdown of the fan base, we kind of have to establish the sheer unprecedented statistical absurdity of the situation that triggered it.
The math is it's bleak.
It is so bleak. We have to look at the anatomy of these 44 days.
Let's break down the hard data from that BBC report, because the timeline itself is arguably the most damning piece of evidence. I mean, Igor Tudor managed exactly 7 games.
7.
That is barely a month and a half of football.
7 games. And his record in the Premier League during that time, 0 wins, 1 single point. Out of a possible, 15?
Exactly. And the domestic failure is set against this backdrop of a massive European collapse, too. In the Champions League, the most prestigious club competition in the world, they crashed out spectacularly.
Yeah, the first leg of the round of 16 against Atletico Madrid was just a 5-2 embarrassment, a complete dismantling.
Or dismantling.
I mean, they did manage a Pyrrhic victory in the second leg at home, winning the battle but losing the war on aggregate goals, and getting eliminated. But the real catastrophe was happening in the Premier League. Because of this historically awful run, Tottenham plummeted to 17th place.
17th, which, To put that into perspective for listeners who might mostly follow American sports, where the worst team just gets like the #1 draft pick next
Like
year.
a reward for being terrible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But European football have the trapdoor of relegation. The bottom 3 teams are expelled from the Premier League and sent down to the minor leagues, essentially. Tottenham, a club with literally $1 billion stadium, is sitting exactly one single point above that trapdoor.
And the match that finally broke the entire operation, the one that got him fired, was a 3-0 home defeat. And it wasn't a noble loss to like Manchester City or Arsenal, it was to Nottingham Forest.
A team that was also fighting relegation.
Exactly. At home, in front of 60,000 furious fans.
The casual fan looks at this, and their jaw just simply drops. Actually, a user on the Liverpool subreddit captured the historical absurdity of this timeline perfectly. They literally just wrote, shortest Tudor reign in 400 years.
I love that so much. A brilliant 16th century English history pun about the Tudor dynasty just casually dropped into a football forum.
It's perfect.
But it really highlights how unnatural this whole thing feels.
It does. I mean, let's look at standard league norms for a second. When a team fires a manager mid-season, the expectation is you get the new manager bounce.
Right.
The theory is that simply changing the voice in the locker room, bringing in some fresh energy, will inject enough adrenaline into the squad to secure a few quick wins. So to fire Thomas Frank, hire Igor Tudor, and then fire Tudor 44 days later, it means the club didn't just fail to get a bounce.
No.
They realized they had actively strapped an anvil to the team.
Fans on the Premier League subreddit were frantically trying to find historical comparisons to even make sense of this. Like, they brought up Frank de Boer, who had that infamous stint at Crystal Palace.
Yeah, De Boer lasted 77 days and 4 league games without a single goal. And they also mentioned Sam Allardyce's incredibly brief, controversial stints.
But 44 days at a club of Tottenham's massive size feels entirely different. Like, sacking a manager that fast is like buying a multi-million-dollar house, deciding you hate the foundation, and bulldozing the entire property before you've even paid your very first mortgage bill.
That's a great way to put it.
It implies an almost unfathomable level of miscalculation by the people who bought the house in the first place. So I have to ask you, was there absolutely nothing in Tudor's track record that translated to the English game? Because the BBC piece points out that in Italy, he actually had a reputation for fast starts. He improved points per game at Udinese, Hellas Verona, and Juventus.
Right, and that is the crux of the tactical failure here. Tudor's success in Italy was built on a very specific, uncompromising philosophy. He demands this extreme high-intensity pressing game where players sprint to win the ball back immediately, and he utilizes a really rigid 3-man defense.
Okay.
But more importantly, his man management style is notoriously abrasive. It's a shock to the system approach.
Right, the classic tough love drill sergeant kind of guy, which sounds great in like an action movie, but the reality was he walked into a dressing room that was completely drained of confidence, absolutely ravaged by physical injuries, and his very first public move was to accuse the squad of lacking fitness and desire. Like, he actually called them fatigued.
Which is just a catastrophic misreading of the room. You have a squad that is psychologically fragile. They had just lost Thomas Frank, a manager who was renowned for his emotional intelligence, his, arm around the shoulder empathy. Yeah. So to pivot violently from Frank's warmth to Tudor's iron fist, it induced immediate paralyzing whiplash. In modern sports psychology, you cannot simply scream a depleted, depressed athlete into prime physical form.
No.
Tudor demanded a system that required peak physical exertion from players who were running on fumes.
It's like demanding a marathon runner to suddenly sprint hurdles in the middle of mile 20.
Exactly.
And the result was that 3-0 collapse against Forest. But, here is where this story takes a turn that forced everyone, the journalists, the rival fans, even us podcasters, to take a massive step back. Because it's so easy for us to sit here and talk about tactics and 44-day failures as if it's just, numbers on a spreadsheet.
We treat sports figures as avatars, yeah.
Not human beings.
Exactly. But the digital footprint we analyze from these subreddits reveals this deeply human, deeply tragic complication that occurred right in the middle of this sporting disaster. During this agonizing run of games, Igor Tudor's father, Mario, passed away unexpectedly. It is a really devastating detail. The club issued an official statement of condolence, and when you map the timeline, you see that this profound personal loss happened precisely as the media scrutiny and the fan pressure were reaching an absolute boiling point.
And for our deep dive today, we really wanted to see how this personal grief actually impacted fan sentiment, especially in digital spaces like Reddit, which, let's be honest, are often criticized for being these toxic echo
Oh,
chambers.
for sure.
Like, how does a mob baying for a manager's head react when they find out the man is mourning his father?
The contrast in reactions across the different club subreddits serves as this incredible sociological study on the limits of tribalism.
Let's start with Gorkoys, the Tottenham supporters. Now, you would expect sheer vitriol given the results, but the reaction was overwhelmingly protective.
Surprisingly so, yeah.
When the news of his departure broke, the top comments weren't celebrating the end of a bad tactical era. They were intensely empathetic. A user named PrestigiousEmu6039 wrote, "Poor guy, probably the worst month of his life." Another user, Druidoodle, actually shared a personal story about their own grandmother passing away. They wrote, "A relegation battle with all the media presence isn't the place to be dealing with that kind of grief. I wish him well and hope he's okay."
What we are observing here is the sudden collapse of what psychologists call deindividuation.
Okay, untack that.
De-individuation is this psychological concept where people in a crowd or behind an anonymous internet username, they lose their sense of individual identity and moral responsibility. They essentially adopt the mob's behavior because there are no social consequences for cruelty.
Right. It's why people say things on Twitter they would never ever say to someone's face.
Precisely. But the introduction of profound universal human grief acts as a psychological circuit breaker. The anonymity shield shatters. The Spurs fans suddenly stopped seeing, the incompetent manager destroying our club,
Hmm.
and they started seeing a son who had just lost his father on a global stage.
Hmm.
Their innate human empathy simply overrode their sporting frustration. They managed to compartmentalize the professional failure from the personal tragedy.
And it wasn't just limited to the Tottenham fans either. This empathy actually crossed enemy lines, which in football is incredibly rare. If we look at Interdevils, the Manchester United subreddit, these fans have zero allegiance to Spurs. Zero.
None.
Yet a user there wrote, "May his family find strength. Nothing else should really matter for him at this moment." Another said, "Poor Sod TBH. Father died during an awful stretch of games. Wouldn't wish that upon my worst enemy."
It basically functioned as a temporary digital ceasefire. Mortality is the ultimate universal language. However, and this is where it gets complicated as we dug deeper into the sources, we found that this empathy was not universally applied. Or rather, the transition from tribalism to empathy was incredibly messy and caused severe friction within certain communities.
Yes. Oh man, this brings us to the Liverpool subreddit, Liverpool FC. The tension in those threads was absolutely palpable because when Tudor was sacked, a significant portion of the Liverpool fan base immediately reverted to standard internet protocol, just mocking Tottenham's incompetence. But because of the context of Tudor's father, this created a massive internal civil war within the subreddit.
The moderators actually had to step in and intervene.
They did. A mod had to post a pinned comment at the very top of the thread reminding people to follow the rules and basic etiquette. But the fans themselves started policing each other. Like a user named Comlac3001 called out their own community.
Good for them.
Yeah, they wrote, "This sub should really avoid talking about how unprofessional, poorly run, embarrassing a club is for sacking their managers so quickly, especially when you are highlighting a death that happened. Just absolute zero self-awareness from some here."
And this illustrates the concept of the empathy gap. The friction point occurs exactly where performative tribalism collides with human decency.
Right.
The Liverpool fans who were mocking Spurs weren't necessarily trying to mock a grieving man, they were attacking the institution of Tottenham. But they completely failed to realize you cannot separate the two in that specific moment.
So if you're listening to this and you've always assumed that digital anonymity just universally turns people into monsters, these sources do tell a slightly different story. Tudor's grief actually did force rival fans to step back. There is a line that Reddit won't cross.
But the line is razor thin.
Oh, what is paper thin? Because while they showed empathy for Tudor the man, the very second the conversation shifted slightly away from his personal loss and back to Tottenham Hotspur, the institution, that empathy evaporated, just completely gone.
Instantly.
They took a sledgehammer to the club. And the way these rival clubs laughed at Spurs reveals so much about their own deep-seated insecurities, because in the Premier League, weakness is just blood in the water.
Which leads us directly to the concept of schadenfreude, taking pleasure in the misery of your rivals. I mean, it is the lifeblood of sports fandom.
It really is. But the schadenfreude we see in these sources is incredibly complicated. Let's look at the sheer objective absurdity of Tudor's single Premier League point. Just 1 point in 44 days. Now, if you are a casual observer, you would assume that point came against a terrible team.
A lucky 0-0 draw at home against someone else in the relegation zone, maybe?
Right. But no. His only point came from a draw against Liverpool at Anfield.
Anfield. Arguably the most intimidating stadium environment in world football.
Yeah.
The irony is just staggering.
It's unbelievable, and when you read the Our Liverpool FC reaction, it is a masterclass in self-inflicted psychological pain. Like, the joy of laughing at Tottenham being in 17th place is completely undercut by their own team's failure to beat this historically bad manager.
Yeah, the Liverpool fans are dreading the future embarrassment. One user, DoSherbert3Euro97, painted this incredibly vivid, painful picture. They said, "You'll be in the pub in a few years' time, and one of your mates will ask the following question. Which club did Igor Tudor get his only point for Spurs against in the 25-26 season?"
The dreaded pub quiz question.
It's a permanent stain on their season. And what is truly fascinating here is the psychological pivot. Liverpool fans couldn't just enjoy the schadenfreude. They immediately weaponized Tottenham's misery to attack their own club's leadership.
Oh, the comments turn on their own manager, Arne Slot, instantly. Someone joked bitterly, "Slot is the perfect antidote for a team in peril."
Brutal.
Another pointed out, "I can't laugh when Slot is the only Prem manager who hasn't been able to beat Tudor." And then they start pulling out their own depressing statistics, noting they only have 4 Premier League wins in the entire year of 2026. The joke is aimed at Spurs, but the punchline hits Liverpool right in the teeth.
It perfectly illustrates that in modern football, schadenfreude is rarely pure joy. It is almost always laced with deep self-deprecation. Rival fans laugh at a competitor slipping on a banana peel, but in doing so, they realize they are standing in a minefield themselves.
Let's look at how the Manchester United fans on Sarah Dulles handled it, because they have endured, a decade of their own managerial instability since Sir Alex Ferguson retired?
Yeah, a long time.
So their flavor of schadenfreude leans heavily into history and the idea of curses. We mentioned the 400 years Tudor dynasty joke earlier. The United fans took it even further into the nerd territory.
It really did.
One user asked, "So will he be replaced by a Yorkist?" Another replied, "Give it to Delapole for the rest of the season."
Deep cuts into 15th century English history. The Wars of the Roses. It's a highly intellectualized, almost defensive form of mocking.
It's amazing. But beneath the history jokes, the United fans view Tottenham as fundamentally cursed. And they use this to validate their own recent past. Like, they look at Ruben Amorim, a highly rated manager who United fans really wanted but who ended up elsewhere. The United fans are now joking that Amorim is a hero for saving United from the curse of the Europa League final.
Which is a profound coping mechanism. By pointing at Tottenham and declaring them supernaturally cursed, Manchester United fans are essentially validating their own trauma. They are saying, "Look at Spurs. Running a massive football club is impossibly hard, and it destroys everyone. At least we aren't them right now."
Right. It's like watching your neighbor's house burn down and feeling relieved that your roof only has a massive leak. But let me push back on the sporting analysis for a second here. Because we just established that Tudor took a point at Anfield, and his team actually beat Diego Simeone's Atletico Madrid at home in the Champions League second leg. So if he could draw at Anfield and beat Atletico, was he actually a brilliant tactician who was just entirely incapable of motivating players for a rainy, routine Tuesday night league match against Nottingham Forest?
Well, I wouldn't call him a brilliant tactician based on those isolated results. I would call him a classic impact manager. And there's a massive difference.
Okay, explain that.
In huge adrenaline-fueled games, a Champions League knockout night under the lights, or a visit to Anfield, the occasion itself does 80% of the motivational work.
Oh, interesting.
The players are naturally hyper-focused. The stakes are undeniable. A manager like Tudor, who demands intense, rigid discipline, can temporarily harness that raw adrenaline and mold it into a cohesive system for 90 minutes.
Because the players are already redlining.
Exactly. But the true test of a manager's elite status is the baseline. Can you motivate a depleted, depressed squad to grind out a 1-0 win against Nottingham Forest on a cold weekend when literally no one feels like playing?
Right.
That requires a foundational culture. It requires intrinsic trust between the players and the staff. And in 44 days, using a drill sergeant mentality on an exhausted squad, building that trust is just impossible.
Which brings us to the anger.
Yeah.
Because while the rival fans are laughing through their own pain, the Tottenham fan base is practically radioactive with fury right now. But when you read the Solokoi's comments, the anger isn't really directed at Igor Tudor.
No, it's not.
They acknowledge the tactics failed, sure, but they view Tudor merely as a symptom. They are pointing their finger straight up at the executive suites. They are looking at the architects of the building.
And this is where the journalism of Phil McNulty at the BBC becomes so vital to the story. He doesn't spend 1,000 words breaking down the three-man defense. He aims the spotlight directly at the boardroom.
Let's look at exactly how McNulty frames this because it's pretty brutal. He writes that the hierarchy has finally addressed the mistake they made with this, quote, outlandish appointment.
Ouch.
Yeah. He points the finger firmly at Chief Executive Vinay Venkatos and Sporting Director Johan Lange. He notes that these two men were entrusted by the Lewis family, the billionaire owners of the club, to lead Spurs into a brighter, data-driven future. And instead, they delivered a historic 44-day unmitigated disaster.
The adjective outlandish is doing incredible heavy lifting in McNulty's piece there. In the very restrained vocabulary of British football journalism, calling an appointment outlandish suggests that within the professional establishment, this hiring made absolutely zero logical sense from the moment the ink dried.
And the sources hint at a hiring process that was just deeply, deeply flawed. Like, there is a wild rumor circulating that Tudor was essentially a leaving gift from the former sporting director Fabio Paratici.
If there is even a shred of truth to that, it represents organizational malpractice on a staggering scale.
Seriously.
You do not hand the strategic direction of a multi-billion-dollar sporting enterprise to a manager as a parting favor to an outgoing executive, especially when the club is teetering on the edge of a crisis.
And the chaos behind the scenes wasn't just in the hiring, it was in a total lack of systemic support once he actually arrived. We already talked about parachuting a high-press manager into an exhausted squad, and we mentioned his tactical preference for a three-man defense.
Yeah.
For the listener who doesn't watch football, a three-man defense requires highly specialized players. Imagine stretching a rubber band across your back line. If you only have 3 anchor points instead of 4, those 3 anchors have to be incredibly strong, incredibly fast, and understand exactly how to cover the gaps.
Very well put.
Spurs simply did not have the personnel for it. It was a complete square peg in a round hole.
And beyond the tactics, there is the administrative incompetence.
Oh man, the work permit fiasco. It's almost comical. A user on the Spurs subreddit pointed this out, just laughing through the pain. They asked, did Tudor's assistant even ever get his work permit? Lol. And another user, JJW1998, replied with the grim reality. There was word that Tudor's assistant didn't have a UEFA Pro license.
Which is critical context. Post-Brexit, the English Football Association introduced really strict governing body endorsement, or GBE, rules. To get a work permit, a foreign coach must meet certain criteria, and holding a UEFA Pro license is a major part of that point system.
So to translate that for everyone, Tottenham hired a manager who relies entirely on his specific coaching staff to implement his incredibly complex, demanding system. And they didn't bother to check if his right-hand man, Ivan Dvorčić, was legally allowed to enter the United Kingdom and step onto the training pitch.
It highlights a lack of basic due diligence that you wouldn't expect from like a mid-level corporate firm, let alone a Premier League giant.
And this specific administrative failure is fueling a much broader, almost existential anger among the fan base about the very identity of the club. There's a massive argument raging on the Premier League subreddit about the Americanization of Tottenham Hotspur. And if you are an American sports fan, you really need to understand the cultural difference here. In Europe, a football club is historically a community asset. It's almost a civic religion. But fans are accusing chairman Daniel Levy of trading a golden generation of footballing talent just to build a lucrative real estate and entertainment empire.
The Tottenham Hotspur Stadium is the physical manifestation of this conflict. I mean, architecturally, it is a marvel. It has a retractable pitch. It hosts NFL games, massive Beyoncé concerts, heavyweight boxing matches.
It's gorgeous.
Financially, it is a brilliant revenue generator.
But to build that billion-dollar stadium, the club took on massive debt. And to service that debt, they absolutely need those NFL games and concerts, which leads fans to believe the actual football team is no longer the priority. One user, Funad6875, wrote a really scathing indictment. They said, Tottenham Hotspur Football Club slowly started dying the day we opened the new stadium. For me, it's been the Tottenham Stadium Entertainment Group for the last 5 years, where the football team has been sacrificed and suffered for the likes of the NFL concerts and other sporting events.
Wow.
They even floated a conspiracy theory that Levy was just tanking the football club to become the owner of a rumored London NFL franchise.
Well, this is a debate about structural failure versus individual failure. The fans are arguing that when the boardroom is entirely focused on maximizing concert revenue and corporate hospitality, the actual sporting decisions like scouting players or, vetting an interim manager's work permit become rushed, poorly researched afterthoughts.
Mhm.
The business is thriving, sure, but the soul of the club is dying.
So the board clearly failed him. They gave him the wrong players, no support, and couldn't even get his assistant a visa. But I have to push back on the narrative that Igor Tudor is purely a victim here. Because as a manager, if you walk into a burning building and you try to put out the fire with a three-man defensive system that your players fundamentally don't understand, and you publicly criticize their fitness while they are emotionally shattered,
Hmm.
don't you still bear a massive amount of responsibility for the ashes?
Absolutely. The structural incompetence of the board does not grant Tudor immunity from professional critique. Having empathy for his personal tragedy does not mean that we ignore his man management failures. Let's look at the incident with the young Czech goalkeeper, Antonin Kinski.
Oh, this was brutal to read about. Just awful.
In the critical Champions League match against Atletico Madrid, Tudor makes a massive high-risk call. He drops the established first-choice keeper, Guglielmo Vicario, and he starts the young, relatively inexperienced Kinski. Now, Kinski makes two high-profile mistakes, essentially handing Atletico a 3-0 lead.
Yeah.
Tudor's reaction. He hooks him off the pitch after just 17 minutes.
17 minutes. For a goalkeeper, being substituted in the first half for performance reasons is the ultimate public humiliation. It destroys a player's confidence.
And it gets worse. As the young Kinski walks off the pitch, totally devastated, Tudor reportedly ignores him completely. He turns his back. He leaves the comforting to the players on the pitch, and to players like Conor Gallagher and Dominic Solanke, who actually followed the kid down the tunnel to console him.
That is the tough love approach failing spectacularly.
It is the abdication of leadership. A manager's primary job, beyond tactics, is to protect his players, especially the young ones. If you make the bold choice to start a kid in a massive European knockout tie, you own that decision.
Exactly.
To throw him to the wolves after 17 minutes and then turn your back on him suggests a manager who is entirely inflexible, protecting his own ego, and utterly lacking the emotional intelligence required for modern man management. So yes, Tudor was a victim of a bad boardroom. But he also struck matches inside the burning building.
It's a toxic combination of structural neglect and individual arrogance. And this boardroom anger leads the fans to a profound existential crisis about what success actually means for a football club. Because all of this failure, all of this 44-day chaos is heavily influenced by the club's incredibly recent history. And this is where my mind was truly blown reading these Reddit threads.
The contrast between their past and their present is dizzying.
Exactly. We have spent the last half hour talking about a team fighting for their lives in the relegation zone, firing managers, relying on kids. But Tottenham Hotspur literally won the Europa League under Ange Postecoglou just the previous season.
They tasted actual European glory. They had the ticker tape parade, they lifted a major international trophy, and less than 12 months later, they are staring down the barrel of the championship.
This has sparked a massive philosophical debate on the subreddits. They are calling it the monkey's paw scenario. You know the old literary trope, you make a wish for something great, but the universe grants it in the most horrific, ironic way possible.
Right.
A fan on a Premier League posed the ultimate question: would you accept winning the Europa League if you knew it guaranteed you would be relegated the very next season? Or would you rather not win the trophy, finish 17th, and stay in the Premier League?
It is the ultimate test of fan psychology. What is the fundamental purpose of supporting a sports team? Is it the pursuit of singular, euphoric moments of glory, regardless of the catastrophic consequences? Or is it the desire for sustainable, albeit sometimes boring, top-flight existence?
And the fan reactions to Tudor and the current crisis are completely divided based on how they answer this question. Some fans are surprisingly at peace with the relegation battle. One user, GUT17, said, "Win Europa easily. I've accepted that Tottenham is a carnival of catastrophes, so might as well have the memories of winning silverware than boring mediocrity."
A carnival of catastrophes. That is a beautiful, tragic acceptance of their club's chaotic DNA.
But then you have the other side of the coin. Another user argued that the Europa League win was actually, quote, "the worst thing to happen to Spurs in the last 30 years, which sounds insane until you read their logic.
Yeah, let's hear it.
They argued that winning the trophy papered over the massive cracks of the club's structural rot. It gave the board, Daniel Levy and the executives, an excuse to say, look, everything is fine, our strategy works, while the foundation was actually crumbling. They believe the miracle win under Postecoglou actually accelerated their current demise by masking the deeper issues that led to the Tudor disaster.
We can use the analogy of the Ben's decompression sickness.
Oh, that's good.
When a deep-sea diver comes to the surface too quickly, the sudden change in pressure creates nitrogen bubbles in the blood, causing immense physical damage. Fan expectations work the exact same way. A fan base that recently experienced the extreme high pressure of European Trophy Parade expects competence. They expect to be dining at the top table.
Right.
When they are suddenly dragged down to the crushing depths of a relegation battle and a manager winning 1 point in 5 games just months later, the psychological transition is too fast. The brain simply cannot process the gap between the expectation of glory and the reality of incompetence. It causes psychological damage, manifesting as the gallows humor and existential dread we are seeing in these forums.
We actually saw a really relevant quote from a rival player on this topic in the source material, didn't we? About how expectations define reality.
Yes, the quote from Christian Eriksen talking about Manchester United. Eriksen said that at United, you don't really celebrate winning the Carabao Cup or the FA Cup. He said it was treated like a normal small day because the history of that specific club demands only Premier League or Champions League titles. He called it weird.
That perfectly highlights how expectations define the reality of success. For Tottenham, the Europa League was a monumental achievement, a drought-breaking ecstasy. For a club like United or Real Madrid, it might be viewed as a consolation prize. The fact that Spurs achieved their absolute peak and immediately plummeted into an abyss is what makes this specific 44-day crisis so agonizing for their supporters.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's the ultimate Faustian bargain for a sports fan. You get the shiny trophy, you get the parade, the confetti, the tears of joy, but the devil comes to collect your Premier League status 12 months later. For you, the listener, thinking about your own favorite sports team, whether it's an NBA franchise, an NFL team, or a baseball club, would you make that trade? Glory today for absolute misery tomorrow. It's a tough call.
And the misery Tottenham is facing tomorrow is absolutely terrifying, which transitions us perfectly from the existential dread to the immediate practical reality.
Right.
Having diagnosed the disease, the boardroom rot, the tactical mismatch, the Faustian bargains, the club is now frantically looking for a 7-game cure.
And the medicine cabinet looks terrifying, to be honest. Let's establish the stakes of this relegation dogfight for the non-football fans listening, because the financial implications are apocalyptic. In American sports, if you finish last, you get the first draft pick and you try again next year. Your TV revenue stays the same.
Right.
In the Premier League, if you finish in the bottom 3, you are relegated to the championship. Your broadcast revenue drops off a cliff.
The financial disparity is astronomical. According to David Ornstein from The Athletic, if Spurs go down, the player contracts have clauses built in to slash their wages by roughly 50%.
50%.
It's a standard protective measure implemented by Chairman Daniel Levy to protect the club from bankruptcy in the event of relegation. But activating it would trigger a mass exodus. Elite international players will simply not play in the second tier for half their salary. They will demand transfers. The squad will disintegrate.
A user on Reddit summed up the indignity of it, saying, "It's absolutely mad that Spurs will play away to Lincoln as equals next season." Lincoln City. No disrespect to Lincoln, they are a proud club, but the financial disparity between these two institutions is usually the size of the Grand Canyon.
Yeah.
To be equals on the pitch, fighting for the same points in the second division is unthinkable for a club with a billion-dollar NFL stadium.
So to avoid playing Lincoln City, who do they hire for the remaining 7 games?
The list of candidates is a mixture of pipe dreams, recycled veterans, and absolute madness. Like, the dream permanent fix is Roberto De Zerbi. He is heavily rumored to be their top choice. He plays beautiful, attacking football. But as the BBC points out, why would a highly rated, tactically progressive manager risk his entire reputation on a 7-game salvage job where he might end up managing in the championship?
He won't. It is career suicide to take the job before the summer, unless survival is mathematically guaranteed. A progressive manager needs a full preseason to implement their ideas.
Exactly. So that leaves the short-term rumors, the firefighters, and this list reads like a fever dream of mid-2010s Premier League football. Sean Dyche, who ironically just got sacked after his own 114-day spell at Nottingham Forest.
The irony.
Ryan Mason, who is the eternal caretaker manager at Spurs. Chris Hughton. Robbie Keane, who is currently managing a club in Hungary, they're genuinely asking if he'd leave a full-time job in another country for 7 games in London.
Madness.
Glenn Hoddle, Tim Sherwood, Adi Hutter, and incredibly, amazingly, 79-year-old Harry Redknapp.
Redknapp has apparently made his willingness to step in clear at 79 years old.
The fans are losing their minds. Some are joking about bringing in Big Sam Allardyce just for the memes. One user asked if Jurgen Klinsmann was still around. The sheer desperation has reached a point where tactical analysis has been replaced by literal magical thinking.
Yeah.
On Circus, users were legitimately joking about relying on Etsy witches, who they paid to cast spells to save the club.
When you are relying on Etsy witches to secure your defensive line, your multi-million-dollar analytics department has truly failed you.
Truly.
But let's outline the psychology of the firefighter manager. Why do clubs recycle these same names, the Deitches, the Allardyces, in a panic? It's because relegation battles are not about long-term vision. They are about immediate, ugly pragmatism. It's a fascinating contrast between the internal fan base debates.
Right.
Half the fans want to plan for the future, demanding a progressive manager like De Zerbi to rebuild the culture. The other half is staring into the terrifying gravity of the relegation zone, screaming that they need a survival specialist who will just kick the ball into the stands, play 10 men behind the ball, and secure a 0-0 draw by any means necessary.
So let me ask you this. Put yourself in the shoes of an up-and-coming manager or even an established one looking at this Spurs job right now. Is this a no-lose situation? Because the club is already a confirmed burning shambles. If you go in and fail, you just blame the board, you blame Igor Tudor, and you walk away. Or is it absolute career suicide to be the guy whose name is forever attached to the Wikipedia page for the season Tottenham Hotspur got relegated?
It is the absolute definition of a poisoned chalice.
Yeah.
If you go in and save them, you are a hero for about 3 weeks. Then the summer arrives. The board decides they want a bigger name or a sexier brand of football for the rebuild, and you are quietly let go.
Oh, for sure.
But if you take them down, you are the captain who sank the Titanic. The stain of relegating a Big Six club with all those international stars will follow you for the rest of your career. The only managers who take this job are those who have absolutely nothing to lose or those whose ego convinces them they can perform a miracle in a month.
And as we look at the broader context of this relegation battle, the only saving grace for Spurs might be the sheer incompetence of others. Several fans noted that Tottenham's survival might rely purely on the fact that Nottingham Forest and West Ham are also playing terribly. It's not about Spurs remembering how to win. It's about hoping the other guy forgets how to swim faster than you do.
It is a grim, grim reality for a club that recently tasted European success.
It really is. Let's bring all these threads together to synthesize what we've unpacked today. We started by looking at a record-breaking 44-day managerial failure, a tenure that was mathematically disastrous and visually humiliating. But as we dug deeper, we saw that Igor Tudor's reign was merely a flashpoint.
Yeah.
It was the spark that illuminated a deeply fractured boardroom. We saw executives making outlandish appointments, failing to secure basic work permits for staff, and structurally prioritizing stadium entertainment and NFL games over the footballing product on the pitch.
We also witnessed an existential crisis within a massive global fan base. We saw fans actively debating the true price of a trophy, using the monkey's paw analogy to ask if the absolute high of a European night is worth the crushing low of a relegation dogfight.
We saw the ruthless pub quiz schadenfreude from rival fans laughing at Tottenham's misery while quietly internally panicking about their own team's inadequacies, looking at you, Liverpool and Manchester United fans.
Right.
But amidst all that tribalism, all that anger and mockery, we also found that fragile, beautiful moment where the digital football community hit pause. Rival fans crossed the aisle, breaking the rules of the internet to show genuine human empathy for a man grieving the sudden loss of his father.
It proved that even in the most toxic digital echo chambers, the shared experience of human mortality can still cut through the noise. It breaks down the deindividuation and reminds us of the person behind the badge.
Exactly, and that is why this story matters so much, even if you are listening to this and you've never watched a single minute of Premier League football in your life. This deep dive is a masterclass in how communities online process massive structural failure. We deflect with humor, we demand systemic change from leadership, we engage in magical thinking with Etsy witches, and we constantly navigate the incredibly messy gray area between performative sports hatred and deep human compassion.
The dynamics of failure and how we cope with it are universal, whether it happens at a corporate boardroom in London or on a subreddit on your phone.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over. We talked extensively about the anger directed at the Tottenham Stadium Entertainment Group. We've seen owners globally in American sports and European football trying to maximize the brand, the synergy, the real estate value of these historic teams. So ask yourself this. If a club's identity becomes so fundamentally fractured by the pursuit of modern corporate success, building entertainment groups, prioritizing Beyoncé concerts, and focusing on brand synergy, what exactly are the fans still rooting for when the sports team itself is fighting for its life?
Right.
Are you supporting a sports team with a soul and a history, or have you just unwittingly become a highly emotional, unpaid shareholder in a real estate holding company?
That is the defining existential question for the future of modern sports fandom.
Think about that the next time you put on your favorite team's jersey or buy a ticket to the stadium. I want to thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives behind the headlines, look beyond the simple explanations for structural failure, and we will catch you next time.